When it was time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. And they kept looking for Jesus, and as they stood in the temple courts, they asked one another, "What do you think? Is he coming to the festival at all? Is he going to show up?" When it was time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. I have been showing up for years. Now, the times and the ceremonies of the church have been a part of my life for years, and they have been a part of your life for years. In fact, I've heard many of you describe your childhood by saying, "We were at church every time the door was open." Sunday school, morning worship, Wednesday evenings. Some of you even went to BYPU, training union, church training, and discipleship training. And if you don't know what those things are, you didn't have to go to church as much as the rest of us did when you were children. Some of you claim to be part of the cradle roll. You know how now you have a baby and you keep them home for a while because you don't want them to catch anything. Back in the day, it was almost a competition to see who could get their babies to the church the quickest and get on the cradle roll. When it was time to be in church, we were there. And we participated in all the ceremonies. We were baptized, we served as acolytes, we shared communion regularly. We've been ashed during Ash Wednesday. We've sacrificed for Lent. We've celebrated Easter for years. We've attended Christmas Eve and candlelight services, dedicated our children, participated in mission projects and trips. We've been to hundreds, thousands of committee meetings as a part of the church. Most of us have been showing up for years, even on time change Sundays. I love time change Sundays. I love it when we spring forward. There's always someone late who walks in the door during the doxology, looks around, turns around, and walks out. I'm not going to tell you who it was this year. I had that wonderful perspective. Or when we fall back, there's always someone in the sanctuary an hour early just sitting here when I get to church. I walk in, they look at me and went, "Yeah, I forgot to set my clock." We've been showing up for years. Pastor Ha is a Vietnamese pastor on the West Coast. I've had the privilege of knowing he serves a language congregation there for Vietnamese people. He's done this for years, and over time, the congregants moved and died in this particular church, and there came a Sunday when no one showed up but Pastor Ha. In fact, for several Sundays in a row. But he showed up every Sunday, sat in a pew and prayed by himself, visited and called and wrote letters during the week until one day some other people began showing up and the church was reborn again. We just show up. It's part of my infamous snow policy. We don't cancel Sunday services even if it snows, even if it snows a lot, because someone might show up. And so I'm determined to show up. I've been showing up at gravesides and hospital beds and nursing homes and your children's basketball games and soccer games and dinners and circles and court trials. We show up. It's what we do. And so we hear and understand these verses in John chapter 11 when it says, "Now when it was time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before Passover." We can relate to these folks in verse 55 because time and ceremony are two words that carry the weight of our religious traditions. And on this particular day in John chapter 11 in Jerusalem, the people showed up again. We have been showing up for years. And although me showing up and you showing up is always important, keep showing up, the most important question of this text comes in verse 56. Is Jesus going to show up? So they kept looking for Jesus, and as they stood in the temple courts, they asked one another, "What do you think? Is he going to come to the festival at all? Is Jesus going to show up? In first century Jewish life, well, not just in first century Jewish life, but in every century since the Exodus, even until today, our Jewish cousins show up for Passover. It's a sacred time, a sacred ceremony. So utensils are cleansed, and rooms are cleansed, and homes are cleansed. There's a gathering of family, and the cooking of eggs and lamb shanks, and the smell of herbs, bitter and sweet, and the taste of wine. And in the middle of all this preparation in John chapter 11, during this holy time, during this sacred ritual, someone asked the question, and it's a good question, is Jesus going to show up? It's interesting that John chapter 11 ends with this question, because it's the same question that begins John chapter 11. Do you remember the beginning of the chapter? Lazarus has died. Mary and Martha, his sisters, have called for Jesus to come, and in the first few verses of John 11, they're wondering, is Jesus going to show up? John 11 begins and ends with people wondering, will Jesus show up? Here's my question. What chapter are you in right now? That's John chapter 11. What chapter are you in right now? What chapter are you going through in your life? What did you carry in here with you today? What have you been carrying with you for days? And I'm wondering if you're like most of us, have you asked the question at least once recently, is Jesus going to show up? Now, do you want the long theological answer to that, or do you want the short answer? Short answer, I know. Is Jesus going to show up? Is God going to show up? Of course He is. God always does. This is the God of whom the psalmist wrote, "Where can I go from your presence? If I go to the highest heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, you are there. You always show up." This is the Jesus whose last words to His disciples were, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end. I promise I'll show up." I was reading a Sunday school lesson some time ago, and one of the learning activities that the writer suggested was that you sit down and think about the most difficult situation that you are dealing with today and write that difficult situation down on a piece of paper, and at the end of that little story put these two words, "and then." And then. Because here's the deal. Our best guess at how any situation or how our life will end is nowhere close to what God has in store for us. It's nowhere close to what God has imagined for us. And so in verse 56, they kept looking for Jesus, and they stood in the temple courts and they asked one another, "Is He going to come to the festival at all? Do you think He's going to show up?" I wonder where Jesus is going to show up in your life before this hour is over. I wonder where God is going to show up in your life before this week is over. The first time I heard Rudder's Requiem was in the late 1980s, 1989. It was just a few years after its composition. I was seated next to a friend who was also a minister. He had lost his teenage child, one of his two children, just months before in an accident. And as those last melodic lines were being sung, that familiar motif that begins and ends the Requiem and is woven throughout it, you'll hear it in a moment. Da 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 da. As it was being sung for the last time during the Lux Eterna, I looked over and tears were just trickling down his cheeks. And I leaned over and whispered as solemnly and quietly and sacredly as I could, "Are you okay?" And staring straight ahead without ever looking at me, he said, "God just came close." Is Jesus going to show up? Of course He is.